We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, there shall just be people.
4 years after his murder at the hands of apartheid security police, Steve Biko's contemporaries reflect on his life and legacy. We also meet two scholars who share with us their experiences of having to stand in front of students and teach them about Biko, his life and ideas. We close the show with an interview with the man who was very young, 6 years of age, when his father died, now in charge of the project that celebrates his father's legacy. Nkosinathi Biko talks to us about what the future holds for the organization that yesterday came of age. The Steve Biko Foundation has been operating for 21 years. All that coming up in tonight's episode of Watchdog, which starts right now.
Changes which are to come can only come as a result of a program worked out by black people. And for black people to be able to work out a program, they need to defeat the one main element in politics which was working against them, and this was a psychological feeling of inferiority.
A political activist, a prominent thinker, an author and founder of the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa. Bantu Stephen Biko was born on the 18th of July 1946 in Ginsberg, a township near King Williamstown in the Eastern Cape. From a very early age, Biko demonstrated an insatiable appetite for knowledge. After completing school, he registered for a degree in medicine at the black section of the medical school of the University of Natal in 1966. Driven by the passion to revolutionize the way black people thought of themselves, he drew on the experiences and the approaches of other black thinkers before him, such as Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, whom he quoted extensively in his writing. Biko believed the only way to effect fundamental change in apartheid South Africa would be for the oppressed people themselves to take the initiative and to work for their own liberation. Biko's ideas about being proud of being black became known as black consciousness.
We don't believe, for instance, in the so-called guarantees for minority rights, because guaranteeing minority rights implies the recognition of portions of the community on a race basis. We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, there shall just be people.
Banning orders were soon slapped on a number of people associated with the Black Consciousness movement. Biko was then banned and restricted to King Williamstown. On the 18th of August 1977, Biko was arrested while traveling home from a political meeting in Cape Town with his friend Peter Jones. He was detained in Port Elizabeth for 26 days under the Terrorism Act. It was during this period that Biko sustained a massive brain hemorrhage. The police first claimed he had starved himself to death while on a hunger strike. It was only 20 years later that the police admitted before the TRC that they had killed Biko. The brutal circumstances of Biko's death caused a worldwide outcry, and he became a symbol of black resistance to the oppressive apartheid regime.
To help us reflect on the life and legacy of Steve Biko, let's welcome our first guests, both Biko contemporaries and leaders themselves, leaders of the Black Consciousness movement, Dr. Musibudi Mangena and Dr. Seth Cooper. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen, and thank you very much for your time this evening. If I may start with you, Dr. Cooper. I mean, as someone who knew Steve Biko personally, and it's probably a question you've been asked numerous times before. What do you say when people ask you, who exactly was Steve Biko?
Biko was the spark that ignited our open resistance to physical, mental, social, and economic subjugation on the southern tip of Africa. We have yet to deepen and safeguard these issues that have emerged during our democracy. We have yet to build the necessary bridges, and Biko worked to restore our common humanity while attempting to forge a consciousness amongst youth, particularly students in high school and university. And also, he was an architect in founding the Black People's Convention, of which at the time of his murder, he was honorary president of. And we should be celebrating his life and legacy because he's been paid tribute to by nearly every president that our country has had the pleasure of having as their leader, including the current one who, at the time of Biko's ascendancy, was a high school student and ended up being in Turfloop as the local branch chair of SASO, the organization that Steve Biko led and was the founding president of. So there's an entire legacy that actually we can do well with in the chaos, in the almost fratricidal picture we see around us, where we label each other by colors or by narrow ethnicity, and we look at persons in a way that is inimical to their being part of the human species that all of us belong to. So Steve actually conscientized me, conscientized many of us who have gone on to do other things in life in our country. And you can see that particularly in the panoply of leadership across all sectors in our society.
Mr. Mangena, what do you say, who do you say Biko was when people ask you?
Well, he's all those, and he's a hero that was taken from us at such an early age, at the age of around 30, and he had written so much. He had so much in-depth knowledge of us as a people, and he attempted to conscientize not only the students at universities and in the high schools, but also communities. And he wanted all of us to get involved at a practical level in our communities. He folded his sleeves and went into poor communities such as Dimbaza, where people were dumped, to go and help people help themselves. He went into Phoenix to try and dig latrines in areas where people did not have latrines. He went into Winterfeld with some of us to go and help our mothers and aunts and grandmothers to read and write. And in the process, ensure that people themselves realize that they have the agency, that they can change their circumstances, that they are not as inferior and helpless as what oppression has said to them in the more than 300 years of our oppression. That the denigration that we were subjected to, socially, politically, and economically, can be overcome, and it can be overcome by us. And it is a pity that now that we have achieved a democracy, we seem to have regressed, and the solidarity that he engendered in his life, in his work, seems to have left us to such an extent that we do not think that we have agency anymore. That 27 years after the attainment of that democracy, we still humiliate one another with bucket toilets, with mikuku, with single-sex hostels, and the damage that we do to one another through the burning of the schools of our children, the clinics, the libraries, and so on. And this is a tragedy if you imagine that 27 years have elapsed since we got democracy, which means that if we had used our agency, we would be much further than where we are presently.
Now, both of you are at various points in your lives had to lead organizations that carried the flag for black consciousness. How both of you also, went to Robben Island, where you mixed with a lot of people from other schools of thoughts or who believed in or who put a great deal of emphasis on different things. Now, how easy or difficult was it for you to actually, articulate the ideas that Steve Biko stood for, given, the impressions or views that other people had of him and what he could have been? Seth?
Well, look, I think there was a culture shock for the generation of Madiba, because they did not expect, one, that after their organizations were banned in April 1960, after the Sharpeville and other massacres in March that year, that we would have the chutzpah to form a political organization, which we did. And we were well aware that we would be banned, that our organizations would be banned. But in that short period that we had outside of banning orders, and in that short period that we had where we mobilized, we did our damnedest to ensure that people spoke with one voice, emerged with the solidarity. So we were looked at somewhat peculiarly by the Mandela generation, because they could not understand that here were people who came from diverse ethnic backgrounds, particularly in terms of race classification, where you had white, so-called colored, Indian, and then African, that we could be in one organization as black persons. And fairly quickly, though, Madiba did take to the issues of being black, because he asked those questions, and in correspondence with Musibudi, I'm sure he will reveal some of that. But I was in that same cell block for about 5 years with Madiba, and we used to have these discussions on non-racialism versus blackness, and whether black was necessarily anti-white, and so on and so on. They couldn't understand also how it is that we were able to organize without relying on white resources, without relying on white leadership, and without involving whites in the essential organizational dynamics of our struggle. But eventually, I think they came to understand and appreciate what that meant. But I must say, the hard-nosed Stalinists amongst those prisoners just simply could not accept blackness. They thought it was a chauvinism. And that kind of silly, narrow, bigoted belief caused conflict in prison, where names would be called. Of course, Biko had to be a CIA agent. All of us had to be agents of something, because there was black power in the United States, and there was black theology, and then the connections made would probably result in us being lackeys of the West. And then getting shocked when our organizations actually resisted any engagement with the likes of the Ted Kennedys, with the likes of others who visited the country and wanting to know how come your organizations don't meet and engage with such people. So there was a definite break from the liberalism of the past to a much more revolutionary black fervor, where we confronted ourselves and confronted that very powerful state, which Mandela never ceased to tell me had infiltrated all our organizations. And I know that that is very true. No system like apartheid would leave us alone. So all our organizations were, as he put it, infiltrated from the top to the bottom.
So what was your experience?
I remember I was the first Black consciousness person to land on Robben Island. Mm-hmm. So I was a quaint element, I was a strange element. And the inmates were pleased that I arrived, in a sense. I mean, it is a tragedy that somebody should land in prison. But you see, it had been 10 years since they were incarcerated on the island. And I think there were many of them who were beginning to wonder whether the general population in the country, particularly young people, have forgotten about the struggle, whether they have given in, whether they have surrendered, and they have accepted their lot as oppressed people. So when I arrived there, I gave them hope that they are not forgotten, especially because, especially in its early days, the Black consciousness movement embraced those who were involved in the struggle historically, including the older organizations. And so I was welcomed on Robben Island. I remember the first time I interacted with the Madiba, we were lying on our bellies. As Seth knows the geography of those two sections. There is a courtyard and there is an iron door with some squares, open squares at the bottom. In order to see each other, I had to lie on my belly on my side, and he lay on his belly the other side, and we saw each other, and he welcomed me on Robben Island and welcomed the fact that the struggle is continuing. But we corresponded over time. When I moved to another section, we exchanged lots of notes in which it was very general about being united as a people and so on. But I must say that the younger members of the prison population were much more amenable to new ideas that we brought. And we discussed so much in our cells, political discussions about different ideologies and so on. And I remember when even more younger people arrived on Robben Island, the debates intensified in the section in which I was. Everything, Marxism, Black consciousness, Pan-Africanism, and so forth. And in fact, we are the ones that encourage or introduce political discussions across organizational lines. Because before we arrived, each organization had its own little group where they discussed alone without the others. And so we introduced this, and we differed. Many of us were asking questions about socialism, about Marxism, about whether it is working or not. I remember we discussing why Czechoslovakia had to be invaded and whether that was the right thing or not. And we discussing, I'm a mathematician by training, asking whether in Des Capital, the formula that defines several concepts, including profit and so on, are valid under the present circumstances, and whether they are working in America, whether they are working in the that is practically, empirically, are they working or not? So there were those discussions that they were not used to having, and now they were having. And as Seth said, we challenged everything. Prison life, for example, being classified as group D, C, A, and B, and fighting the prison warders at every turn because we were refusing to submit to the rules of prison and so on. And because we had an understanding that no prisoner should be punished alone, we had to go on hunger strike when the young ones refused to eat if there was a mistreatment of a prisoner by the warders. And once the BC people went on hunger strike, the whole prison had to go on hunger strike. And I was the ambassador, we had a contact system where you are a link with the other organizations. So I was an ambassador connecting with the PAC, with the Unity Movement, and with the ANC. And they would ask me to please talk to these youngsters, not to go on hunger strike all the time. This is prison, it's hard, and somehow you've got to learn to adapt and to accept some of the regulations, even if you don't like them.
Now, what Masibudi is not telling you, he's to be called Ngwanesu by Madiba in all his communications. So, yeah, very fondly.
Now, over the past few days, South Africans have been, took to social media, talk about how they remember Biko, the respect they have for him, and so on. But also, a lot of people bring up, some of their favorite quotes from his writings and the things that he said. I'm going to just play one clip, Steve Biko, in his own words, and I'm going to ask you something after that.
Any changes which are to come can only come as a result of a program worked out by black people. And for black people to be able to work out a program, they need to defeat the one main element in politics which was working against them, and this was a psychological feeling of inferiority.
Looking back at what was ushered in 1994 on the back of all those talks, negotiations, and everything, when we look at what the situation confronting us today, is it what Steve Biko was talking about in that clip, Satskupa?
No. I became a psychologist on Robben. I decided to become a psychologist on Robben Island, gave up the law. But clearly the psyche of Black South Africa, 27 years after the putative end of apartheid, it remains blighted by mental subjugation, where white is the aspirational standard, connoting excellence, superiority, and the epitome of desirability. And blacks have been subordinated in all spheres of our life, despite the majority demography. And the insidious resurrection of the term non-white as that patently inferior name intended to diminish, inferiorize, and render effete and ineffectual as an appendage of white that has struck at the core of how we see ourselves, and particularly for young people. And we've seen the outpourings during the roads and then the Fees Must Fall campaigns. And Biko's ideas of psychological liberation as an essential precondition to physical freedom and unashamed, unapologetic assertion of Black humanity, pride, and selfhood have become as alluring today as they were when igniting us as youth in the 70s at the height of racist oppression. But you see, today, we don't have to fight that racist oppression. It is the oppression internalized, but by huge sections of our leadership across different sectors. And at that rendezvous of victory in 1994, I'm afraid we had, with the clear exception of Mandela, Mbeki, and a handful of others, we had half human beings entering leadership. And even though we had a pantheon of good liberation fighters, what we've left with now is a pitiful disgrace, with every newscast, every news bulletin tells us fighting. And of course, we heard Pule Mabe tell us that the ANC has been hijacked by thugs and criminals and so on. Today, it tells us the extent to which we ignored the element of psychological oppression which we need to confront in our society.
So, Mangena, I wanted to listen to this clip. It's one of the clips that people play a lot of times, and this past weekend was no different. People posting it up on their social media accounts, and so take a listen.
We see a completely non-racial society. We don't believe, for instance, in the so-called guarantees for minority rights, because guaranteeing minority rights implies the recognition of portions of the community on a race basis. We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, there shall just be people.
Mr. Mangena?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what we had envisaged. That's what he had envisaged. But unfortunately, it will not happen. This non-racial and what I call anti-racist society will not emerge any soon in this country, because the vast majority of us Black people, and including those that are in leadership positions in all spheres of our lives, are overtaken by inferiority complex, by colonial mentality, by slave mentality, and so on. We do not believe that Black people are equal to everybody else. That's why we do not believe that we can, this is the one that really hurts most. We do not believe that we can teach our children. We are the only ones who want our children to be taught by other people. We will break a leg to do that. And we will break a leg that they are not taught in their own languages. And in fact, now indigenous languages and languages of our different communities are dying under our watch. You know, the classics that we had in the various languages, the classics that we read at school no longer exist. You can't find them anywhere. And you go into any bookshop, you won't find books written in our languages. Go anywhere, go into any bookshop, you won't find any. And try to write a book in our languages, you will struggle to find a publisher who will accept that work. Now, we are continuing to transmit this inferiority complex to our children. They grow up knowing or being taught that their uncles who are teachers, their aunts, their fathers, their mothers, their neighbors who are teachers can't teach them. Somebody else can give them an education. And when they go, wherever they are sent by these parents who are overtaken by colonial mentality, they are oppressed, they are ridiculed, they are abused in so many ways. They are told that their hair is not okay. They are told that they can't speak their languages in those schools, whether they are private schools or so-called Model C schools. And yet we are in power. You know, why is it that from the president down, we've got Black people, they are in charge of the budget, the Minister of Education, the MECs of Education, the Director General, the budget are all in our hands. The teachers in the classrooms are black, but we can't teach our children. Okay. What is that?
Because contemporaries and leaders of the Black Consciousness Movement, Drs. Seth Cooper and Musibudi Mangena. After the break, a conversation with two scholars whose jobs in part entail teaching others about Biko's life and ideas. Don't go away. Welcome back. On the show tonight, we're reflecting on the life and legacy of Steve Biko. And if you've just missed it, a short while ago, we had some of Biko's contemporaries reflecting on his life and legacy. Let's now welcome two women whose work involves standing in front of others and talk about Biko. UCT Historical Studies lecturer Ms. Kamalita Naika is currently teaching a module on the life and times of Steve Biko. Dr. Ati Nangamso Ngopo is a Black consciousness adherent, also a co-author and editor of Roads Must Fall, The Struggle to Decolonize the Racist Heart of Empire. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for your time. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Naika. Talk to us very, very briefly about the module that you're teaching. What is it about? Who, do you teach it? Who are the students that you are teaching?
Okay, so firstly, thank you for having me. And my module is not specifically on Biko, but obviously it's a part of it. I teach in the Historical Studies department, and we have a section dedicated to Black consciousness. It's actually part of a South Africa since the 1900s course. And basically what I try to do, and I've just actually finished teaching this component, and I think part of why I include it is really to think about why would we teach Biko today, and how is Biko's thought relevant for contemporary political society in South Africa today? And I think two things that I think are worth highlighting here, and maybe some of the two things that remain kind of obscured when we think about Black consciousness today is the first is Biko's critique of a specific kind of class analysis that was kind of quite dominant in the 1970s. And the second thing, I think, is the way in which Biko actually invites us to think about difference within Black society and within Black community itself. And I think that this is quite relevant for the ways in which we're thinking about current politics. I think especially around the ways in which we think about non-racialism today and how it's being used. And I think one of the most significant things when we look back on some of Biko's writings today is actually to think about how he's actually not talking about a kind of fragile unity and a kind of homogenizing discourse, but really how he's inviting us to think about and think through difference between what is broadly categorized in a kind of Biko's conception of Black consciousness, which was African, Indian, and colored people. And I think for Biko, this, the idea of Black solidarity was both about a political consciousness, but also about a way in which to think about, Black people not as appendages either to white racial capitalism and also white society. So I think for me, what I try to highlight here is in some ways the importance of thinking about this, the way in which Blackness is still and remains tied to material conditions, which I think is missed in a lot of the ways in which people don't think that Biko had a critique of class, or that Black consciousness had its own critique of class and racial capitalism. And the second, of course, is how Biko really invites us to do a double move. And I think this is one of kind of very significant things today, which is first to think about how the white gaze or whiteness subjectifies us and makes us relate to each other. And I'm talking about within Black society here through a series of stereotypes, misrecognitions, and racism within Black community and society. And how would we begin to start being conscious of this? And how we would start to do, I think, the hard and difficult work of thinking through a relationship with each other beyond the white gaze and outside of this whiteness. Okay. So how do we think about relating to each other outside of the white gaze, but in a way that recognizes difference in all its varieties, and without a kind of reduction to a homogenizing idea. So, okay, I'm just going to end there because I can hear you trying to interject.
Yes. Dr. Atnangamso Ngopo, I mean, it must be tricky for you as well to, ever so often having to stand in front of people and talk about the very issues that Carmelita was talking about, coming from, that Black consciousness background that you are coming from in societies that it must be particularly difficult for you to, especially having to be, outside your sort of own country, and having to espouse these views and ideas to people who may not be as readily, welcoming of such ideas as perhaps many South Africans would, and I'm using this very advisedly because, again, I don't want to fall into the trap, the very trap that Carmelita was talking about, homogenizing our people. Just your thoughts.
It's punishing work, trying to do non-racialism work and trying to advocate or advance the ideas of Black consciousness outside of the South African context, but more and more even inside. And I think the most difficult thing about, at least my experience with Black consciousness politics, with the ideas of Biko and his contemporaries, is that once I've done an honest reading of Biko over the years and an honest analysis of anti-Blackness all throughout the world, I've had to make some concessions, which I think would have been very difficult for Biko himself to make, and which I think are decisions that he makes because they are politically expedient, all of which is completely understandable to me and I think is beneficial. But I think Black consciousness, at least according to Biko, is very much a psychic project of trying to disalienate the Black person from themselves. And this is an aspect of Frantz Fanon, from whom, one of the writers and thinkers from whom Biko gleans the idea of Black consciousness. But I think beyond thinking about race in these psychic terms, I think it is also very important for us to face the issue of Blackness in the world as a structuring reality. And so we can take from Biko, when we look at South African society, and make an indictment that South Africa is an unethical country grounded on very unethical sets of arrangements. And so while the psychic work of disalienating ourselves from the inferiority complex that is imposed on us by over 500 years of white supremacy, it is also important for us to study the set of arrangements that create a place like this, because it is actually not the truth that I am inferior as a Black woman, but the structure of the place in which I exist, how much I get paid, when I can be inside and outside, what my life chances are, what the chances of me being violated every minute of the day are, is a material, tangible fact of my Blackness. But it isn't itself the truth. And so I think we ought to do a more nuanced reading or engagement with Black consciousness that understands the psychoanalytical, the psychic health rejuvenating work of decolonizing our own minds about ourselves, understanding how it is that we became and are Black in the world. But it is also important to recognize how those, I guess, fables of slavery and colonialism have become self-fulfilling prophecies. So that if it was the case that white settlers decided we were, poor and disposable 500-600 years ago, it is in fact now the case that we are disposable. If you look at the labor market, if you look at the value of our lives in the face of state apparatus. And this is not to say that the objection of Black people kind of condones the ways in which our Black government has humiliated us, like the previous speaker was saying, and continues to humiliate us in the country of our birth. It is possible to say that the Black government, Biko said, would become the face and ineffectual to changing the conditions of Black people, is in fact a condemnable, deplorable state of affairs, while at the same time understanding that white supremacy's set of arrangements still organize an in fact Black-led country. And as such, the condition of Black people has not changed, if it has not statistically gotten worse than the time at which Biko made this recognition. So it is difficult work because there is resistance on either side. Contemporary South Africa would like to run with the idea of non-racialism and use particular quotes of Biko in order to push a project that we can recognize up to the stage of 27 years has failed. And on the other, where white supremacist structures really actually factually punish, alienate, and anticipate the work of emancipating Black people as undesirable and still unacceptable in the mainstream.
Ms. Naika, I suppose, I hope I'm not being presumptuous here, that you were referring to, in part, to that nuanced reading that Dr. Atina Ngamso was referring to when you ended your first input by saying we do indeed have some hard and difficult work to do going forward.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that this is this is the point. I think that the ways in which this is a structural reality is incredibly important. And I think the ways in which this is built into a kind of epistemic, conditional way in which, the kind of foundation of the South African state is really a white settler state, and that we need to recognize that the way in which the state is structured is really to maintain the interests of particular kinds of people, and that I think it's important to understand the difference between a state and a government. And I think not many people, in fact, do know the difference. And I think that what that means is that is extremely deep structural and ideological work that has gone into the kind of legal, economic, juridical framework in which our society functions. So it's not just, a way in which one policy can change something, but I think it requires really a systemic understanding, and really the idea that everybody has to recognize that. And I think for a long time, and I think many people just think that that's the work of specific people or people in the government, but we know that that's not the case. People in this country who hold a very specific place economically and financially needs to also recognize how kind of deeply systemic this inequality is, and how it really functions on a long history of racial inequality and systemic racism. And I think that is kind of one of the And I think, just to go back to I think Biko's writing himself, and in this essay on Black consciousness, what he's saying is that we need to recognize that we are all oppressed by the same system, but we also need to recognize that we are oppressed to varying degrees. And this is a deliberate design to stratify us, not only socially, but in terms of our aspirations. And I think that is something we have to take very seriously, that if we don't recognize the way in which the system is hailing us all in very different ways, we might not actually be able to see the bigger picture.
Dr. Hatnangamso Ngopo, very briefly, when you look at, Ms. Naika mentions the way the state is structured, but also, of course, the policies of the government. Do you think the way, or what you call the value of our lives in front of the state has to do with perhaps a lack of understanding or appreciation, perhaps, of the things that someone like Steve Biko stood for, the things that they were driving, what they tried to teach us?
Well, I think that the ways in which this government and its organs and its support system have attempted to frame non-racialism has been quite liberal, actually, and would have been heavily critiqued by Biko himself. It's the same attitude that he critiques of white liberals and of white Marxists who want to make the problem go away and say that, class is the problem, or the old guard of apartheid is the problem, that if in fact we just move on and kind of dissolve these categories in the public sphere, then they will go away. But I think Biko would be very critical of that himself. And I think his analogy of clearing the table and setting an African table is a demonstration of, I guess, this compulsion that we have, which is, it is not going to take rewriting a paper or publishing a white paper or a Black economic empowerment program to restructure South Africa so that it works for all of those who live in it, right? It is going to take understanding why it's important to have whiteness at the top and as a magnet towards which we all irresistibly aspire towards, even like in very coerced ways, and Blackness at the bottom as a thing from which everybody else must escape and resist. And the trouble and the complication is in the Black community that Biko has set up, is that there are communities of Black people who imagine themselves as being capable of escaping that state of Blackness. And then there are categories of Black people who are overdetermined from outside. By their mere appearance, all of the attributes of Blackness kick in, whether or not they themselves are accurately described by those descriptions. Okay. And so I think the government has taken the ideals of non-racialism, which are, in Biko's view, about a post-emancipated society and not a starting point from which we can kind of dissolve these categories in our minds, create a rainbow, and then proceed as though the fact of being Black does not, make your life cheap, make your labor much more disposable, and confine you to a condition that is overwhelmingly impoverished and, kind of a deathly way to live. Because if you look at the humiliating conditions under which Black people have had to live, it is easy to see why it is the case that there is so much death in Black communities, in African Black communities in particular.
Wish we had more time, but that's where we're going to leave it this evening. Thanks to both of you, UCT Historical Studies lecturer, Ms. Kamalita Naika, and Dr. Ati Nangamso Ngopo, a Black consciousness adherent and co-author and editor of Roads Must Fall. When The person we're going to speak to next was only 6 years old when his father died. He's now leading, the preservation of his legacy. Nkosinathi Biko joins us now. Good evening, Nkosinathi. Thanks. Okay, we seem to have a problem with Nkosinathi's link. I want to play a clip which was actually very interesting, taken from our archives, where, we seem to have re-established that link. Nkosinathi Biko is there. Nkosinathi, good evening. Thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, Ben. Good evening to your listeners and to your viewers.
Well, we watched the lecture yesterday. It's been 21 years of these lectures now, which means that it has really come of age. The question is, where to next? Where are you taking this project to after this?
Well, the lecture uses Steve Biko as a backdrop, but it always tries to focus on some contemporary issues. And so we, to the extent that it is that way positioned, I suspect that it will continue to have relevance. Mm-hmm. And it's true, it seems like only the other day that we had the first lecture given by Professor Njabulo Ndebele, which was titled Ipindlela. And when you look at the total portfolio of speakers, I think we've been able to identify some of the top thought leaders, not only from South Africa and Africa, but in the diaspora. It is always challenging, of course, to find the next speaker and keep ahead of the last year. But the public has come to be very involved in making recommendations that we consider at the foundation.
Mm-hmm. Of course, I mean, the lecture itself isn't the only thing you are busy with. I mean, among others, together with lots and lots of other families, you want the truth to come out. You want closure. And I remember, I think it was about a couple of months ago when the Kalata family, wrote to the National Prosecuting Authority, asking them to indicate whether they will be charging some people and they are going to pursue these cases. How far is that particular project? I know you've been having all these conversations with the Kalatas, with the Timols and a lot of others.
Yes. So first, just briefly on the work that we do, there is a lot happening in between these lectures, anchored by the Steve Biko Foundation and the Steve Biko Center. And then we work through a vast network of institutions, and some of them actually not even here, that are inspired by the legacy of Steve Biko, such as the Cultural Institute in Brazil, the Steve Biko Association in Liverpool, the Frantz Fanon Foundation in France, and so forth. At a different time, I'm sure we'll have time to talk at length about that work, which tends to be invisible. But on the issue of prosecutions, there were recommendations made by the TRC at the end of its mandate. And they identified something in the order of 300 cases that they recommended needed to be prosecuted by the state. In there are various categories of cases of violations of human rights, such as, for instance, deaths in detention, of which Steve Biko is a part. There are political assassinations, such as Talatas and Mqenge. So they were not necessarily detained, but were assassinated. And there are various other categories of human rights violations. And it has become apparent, particularly through the trials of, at least the attempts to bring on trial João Rodrigues, that there was political interference by some of our state machinery. We've taken it upon ourselves as these families to move that process forward. And the driver is not so much obsession with prosecution, as it were, but there is something particularly bothersome about a nation that will have in excess of 300 cases whose official explanation for death is slipped on a bar of soap. or suicide. And we already know in the case of Biko and others that that is not true. And we need to ensure that we can gift these agents of our democracy, these activists, their rightful place in history by correcting those files. And we may not be successful in all of them, but I think that as a collective, we will certainly be able to make our contributions to our history and correct those files.
That's where we're going to leave it this evening. Thank you very much for your time, Nkosinathi Biko, who of course runs the Biko Foundation, which yesterday organized that lecture in honor of Steve Biko. And as Nkosinathi was pointing out, the lectures really do explore the state that we are in as a nation and as a people. That's where we're going to leave it this evening. To join us again tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock sharp. That's when the Tuesday's edition of the Watchdog will start tomorrow. Don't go. Well, have a good night.